Nothing happening here. Oh, this is lecture 4 in the Western intellectual political tradition. And today I'll be discussing Thomas More's Utopia, lighting down on Erasmus once again, and concluding with Richard Hooker's The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. When we think of conservatism today, there is a tendency to think lighter state, more power to the individual, market economy, freedom of the individual from anything that impedes what they see as their rights to liberty and individuality and choice and agency, all being equal and exercising those liberties. And the state often becomes impediment for many, either economically or personally, in achieving those ends. And so the state versus the individual is often pitted against one another. And so in the extreme right you get libertarianism, the left anarchism, and various forms of conservatism as a political philosophy are yet once again suspicious of the state, except for obviously policing within and then threat of invasions from without, hence usually some form of significant military. But other than that, the state should stay out of people's private and personal lives. Now, is this how a Tory would understand the role of the state? In a very minimal way, and society then is held high as the best means of exercising freedom, liberty, and these other elements of liberalism itself, which emerged from late medieval thought, accelerate with the Protestant Reformation, and certainly by the time of Locke, Hume, Smith, and Burke, and others. It almost becomes the creed of liberalism in terms of these principles and the role of the individual society versus the state, except in certain essential areas of life and liberty. I want to, as I mentioned earlier, then start with Thomas More, who was Lord Chancellor of England, so obviously held a very high view of the state under Henry VIII, and then move on to Erasmus, yet once again a very, very significant respect for the role of the state and monarchs and kings and queens in being agents of justice and peacemaking, and then conclude with Richard Hooker, who again is often ignored in overviews of history of political philosophy or political theory. Now these thinkers, More, Erasmus, and Hooker, are quite different in their understanding of politics and philosophy than Machiavelli, for example, who's grappling again and again, both in crude but also subtle forms of way of realism, how one gets power, how one keeps power. And this is always secondary to those like More, Erasmus, and Hooker. It's not that they're against power, but the question is, what is the purpose of power? And what is the purpose of the state and society? And so they think in a very different understanding of power. They're not against power because they realize power, and he or she who has it can wield influence for mediocrity, for the best, or for the worst. And so those who tend to turn against power, that itself becomes a position of power. And so one can't get away from power in politics. It's just how it is understood and what is the purpose of power, or the telos of power in that sense. So Thomas More wrote a very important little work amongst many of his works, and very rare in our time to have a politician who is a sophisticated intellectual, well published, well read, grounded in classical thought, and yet one of the key political actors on the stage of his time. Many politicians today just are not too grounded in intellectual thought or history, and those who are often avoid politics because they see it as very much a dimming down of the richness of thought and a compromising of thinking as they get into the muck and the mud of actual politics. But Thomas More held together this tension in an exquisite and significant and mature manner. And his little book, Utopia, is very important. It has a perennial significance for a variety of reasons in understanding a form of Toryism that is quite different than what we call conservatism today. Now, Utopia, which is the small little book, two Greek words, ou and topos, which means no place. And so first of all, I might mention the small little missive is dedicated to Plato's Republic, which itself was a form of utopos, or no place. So we're already getting a hint in Utopia that one has to be very careful, both in theory and practice, of articulating an idealized world that one thinks people can create and live within. And there are serious consequences of that. For someone like More, politics is, on the one hand, for him, if you can't bring about the best, prevent the worst. So politics is at its best, and those in power are about preventing the worst. But it's also about trying to bring a minimal good or an imperfect good into the public realm, or as it were, sailing the ship from the shoreline of what is problematic across the turbulent waters of time on a ship with many different political sailors who see things differently, at least inching across the water of time to a better place, a better land, but certainly not the far shore. As Virgil would say, reaching out our hands to the far shore. So it's already a warning in Utopia. Be careful about hyper-idealizing, either in theory and practice, the perfect world, because often there is much hurt and harm done by those who do that, and we certainly have seen in the 20th century how that occurs. What we would use the image, perhaps the Greek image of Icarus fallen. Icarus, who attempts to fly to the highest and reach the sun, is inevitably wings are burnt and he falls to the ground. And we've seen many Icarus attempts in the 20th century to build the utopia, the good place. And we've seen the catastrophes of which that occurs. So More is already warning in Utopia against a certain intellectual tendency to articulate a vision that promises perfection in time, but in the process of attempting to deliver it, in fact, it leads to much hurt, harm, tragedy, and imperfection, and the goal itself is never attained. So both the means used is problematic, and the end itself is never reached. And so Icarus falls again and again, but in the falling of Icarus, thousands suffer the tragic consequences. The secondary actor in Utopia is Raphael. Now, this period of time in the late 15th century, early 16th century, England, Spain, France, Portugal, many of these significant rising states and empires were venturing forth across the world to what they saw as the New World, which was, of course, was an old world where you had many indigenous peoples. But Raphael was a part of a group that went to this New World. And in this New World, Central America, the sun always shone, there was no war, the work days were short, relationships were harmonious, ecological sensitivity was dominant. In short, it was a utopia. Raphael lived there for many years, and he was inspired by this Edenic-like existence. And at a certain point, he realized there was a stark contrast between the utopia that he was in, and of course this is a fiction that More is creating, because certainly when many of the imperial powers went to Central Latin America, it was far different from the Raphael. But this is a literary device, it's a work of politics More is working on. So Raphael comes back, and Raphael was very good friends with Thomas More, who was Lord Chancellor of England, as I mentioned, who held the highest post in England next to Henry VIII. And Raphael then comes back, and he meets More after being away to this seeming utopia, and he says, I've been to this place in which justice prevails, peace dominates, ecological sensitivity is prominent, relationships are harmonious, there is no war, and we return to England's fair and pleasant land, and their injustice dominates. War, both internally and between powers in Europe and England, dominated. So how can we move England, its fair and pleasant land, from where it is to Raphael's experience? So More says to Raphael, he says, if you are willing to get on the ship of state with me, then we can work together to bring about this good, this pleasant land which you have experienced and you'd like to see, in fact, embodied within England and potentially in Europe itself. Well, Raphael then gets to the point and says, well, if I get on the ship, then I'd have to work with people I disagree with. I'd have to work with temperaments of people that are very different from me. I'd have to make compromises. I'd have to be engaged with people that we lock horns with all the time, and so I would end up, my ideals would be essentially compromised for the purpose of being realistic on sailing the ship across the water of time. And More says, I'm an idealist just like you, Raphael, but to sail the ship from the shoreline of where you don't want to be across the water of time, part of being a public servant is in fact working with people who see things differently, who have different understandings of where the shoreline, how you tack the ship. And he said that's the nature of diplomacy, and it's the nature of politics, and it's not that you slip into a crude realism, it's that the idealism always has to walk hand in hand with a form of realism in which knowing where to compromise is significant and where not to compromise is equally significant. Well, Raphael then says, there is no way that I will compromise my ideals or my perfect ideas for what utopia can be. And so he essentially says to More, well, I can't get on the ship of state in any way because my ideals or my perspective of the perfect will be compromised by engaging people who I differ with and who have very different ideas what that is. So what in fact happens in the Raphael, More says, so what in fact occurs here is the idea of the perfect becomes the enemy of the good, and you will end up spending your time with your friends constantly railing at the ship of state of what it's meant to be, but you refuse to get on the ship of state and be part of that transition. And in that sense, Raphael embodies a form of politics that has extreme or uber ideals, or a perfect notion of what politics should be about. And then when they get involved, they begin to see there's imperfections, there's compromises, there's men and women who are imperfect on the ship, and it offends their sense of perfection or idealism. Then they become cynics or skeptics. And so there's a very close connection then between a form of extreme idealism that can never be actualized in time, and then cynicism, which flows from that because there's a sense of betrayal of the ideals. And so Raphael then spends their time, as do many anarchists or protest politics people today, ever throwing stones and protesting and doing advocacy to the state, but refusing to participate on the ship of state, which can move it from a position of one level of imperfection to a greater level of the good, the better, and even the best, but certainly not the perfect. So what Thomas More is doing here is he's arguing very clearly against a form of idealism which refuses to work with the complex and ambiguous nature of politics, and that those who have this utopian ideal of politics will inevitably become cynics because they don't know how to live in the tension of idealism and realism within the context of the state itself. And so there is this ongoing and perennial relevance of a Raphael and a More. Now More, if you can see then, a Machiavelli is on one side of the realist perspective, that compromising ideals for the purpose of power, whether it's done subtly or crudely, is one perspective in terms of doing politics. The other is the idealist perspective of a Raphael, who's not willing to compromise, negotiate, work with others they differ with, and that's the idealism turned protest advocacy politics that refuses to seriously engage the ship of state. Now, a More is that middle way in which, wary of the Machiavellian tradition on one hand, but wary of the naive idealism on the other hand, that very quickly turns to skepticism, cynicism, when the ideals have to compromise and work with others. But the point to note here in More and a high-tory perspective, it's a very high view of the state and the role of the state, not only in bringing justice for citizens. More was one of the top lawyers in England, and he often worked for free or pro bono for many who could not afford legal advice or the courts, and so he was a man very much concerned with justice and peace, and he was engaged in the courts and struggling for this. So here you have a Tory view of the state as wary on the one hand of a form of realism that capitulates to power, and on the other form a notion of extreme idealism that very quickly becomes cynicism and either retreats into apathy on the one hand, or engages merely in protest politics, but doing protest and advocacy to the state, but refusing to get involved in the very process of the transition into a better way of being publicly and in society itself. Now, Erasmus, who is very good friends with Thomas More, they died within a year of one another, More himself, in challenging the state, particularly Henry VIII, who were one point very good friends, but More chose to challenge Henry. Henry always lived More always lived in the tension between ultimate concerns and the penultimate of politics. And when he chose to challenge Henry VIII, he was finally executed, and his comments was, "The king's good servant, but God's first." And when there becomes a clash between the two, he knew where his priorities lay. But still, the king's good servant, in that sense, the important role of the state. Erasmus, like Thomas More, wrote many articles, essays, letters to monarchs, to princes, future queens, in terms of what it meant to be a ruler, what it meant to educate a ruler, the role and responsibilities of a ruler in terms of a good, peaceful state. Again, like More, realizing that the temptation of utopian schemes came to naught, but on the other hand, be wary of a form of realism in which power becomes the dominant ideology with no sense of ethical shaping or guiding in that sense. Much more could be said about Erasmus and his prolific writings in politics and peacemaking. Was probably the most prominent dove of early 16th century Europe. He had a huge impact on the Anabaptists, and his role in education and elsewhere continues to linger. The Erasmus University, of course, is indebted to Erasmus himself. Now, in moving through the 16th century, particularly Elizabethan England, when Elizabeth comes to power, this is a great flowering of the Renaissance and the Reformation in England, and so Shakespeare embodies the richness and the fullness of that in a literary sense. But Richard Hooker brings together and synthesizes the very best of the Renaissance, Reformation, classical tradition of a Plato and an Aristotle, an Augustine and Aquinas. And his challenge at the time was against the Puritans, particularly an ideal coming from Geneva and Calvin. You could use the Bible, and the Bible had to be the foundation and source of which the city-state, in the sense of Geneva and Switzerland, was founded. And many of the Calvinist reformers, the Bible was the foundation and the only foundation that could be used in terms of its principles when applied for the new kingdom, as it were. Richard Hooker, contra the Calvinists or the Presbyterians in England, the Puritans, many of who came to form the United States, argued, yes, the Bible has a role to play, but there is tradition, there is reason, there is common law, there is history. And so the varied sources Hooker will use in Books 2 and Books 8 of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, he points out very clearly, be wary of those who ignore history altogether, because when all those cairns and markings are gone, how does the state navigate, how do people navigate in their own lives with no memory? But be wary, on the other hand, of the biblicists who think the Bible is the only source of authority and it's the only text that can be used for political thinking and application. Hooker took the position that there are various sources that can be drawn from for a good state and good politics and philosophy and theology, political theory, the best of the classical Greek and Roman and Christian tradition he drew from. So he was a great synthesizer, like Erasmus himself. Interestingly enough, Erasmus spent many times in England lecturing, as well at the invitation of Thomas More and others. So in Richard Hooker, in his laws, you get a very, very high view of the state and the role of the state in terms of being an agent of justice, of peacemaking, and so it is never dimmed or demeaned in any way or seen as merely a contractual arrangement. The state and society are meant to work together for the greater or the common good, or in the English term, the common weal or the common wealth. And this doesn't deny the role of society. And when we often think politics today, the right of center often sees society or grassroots up community as the ways of bringing about the best, and the state is the problem. If a person tends to turn more to the left, there's a dimming of society and an idealizing of the state. Richard Hooker brought together, as any Tory will, the significance of state and society working together. Both have their blind spots, their Achilles heel, but both at their best work together. You have a just, peaceful, and ecologically sane commonwealth in that sense. Again, commons, and of course the commonwealth or the commonweal should not be equated with communism or collectivism, but it's also quite different from extreme individualism and a suspicion of the state as the problem that the individual must overcome to find their own freedom and happiness or purpose or meaning. So from Thomas More through Erasmus to Hooker, we have an understanding of a high-tory perspective, which has an extremely sophisticated understanding of state and society and their role of working together for the good. Society in that classical English sense was the parish. The para oikos just means the bigger family in that sense, beyond the blood family. So the community, parish, not only can mean a church, it also means an area in that sense. So the role of parish and state, or we would use the word community today, and state working together. And as I mentioned earlier, it need not be either or. State is the problem, society is the answer. or state is the answer and society is the problem. So that's an old Tory perspective that doesn't slip into simple either or, which as we move forward into the 17th century, and I mentioned Bacon last week, again, Bacon, like Machiavelli, for different reasons, he was interested in power, knowledge and power. In his case, the role of power contra nature. For Machiavelli, it was power, very, very much power to stay in power politically, but power becomes a key thing within these thinkers, of which people like Thomas More and Erasmus, Richard Hooker, and Hugo Grotius, as we move forward, see the role of politics quite different. And so, in a course in political philosophy, Hooker is often ignored, as is Erasmus and More. So very important to have them as counters to the, in that sense, the Machiavellian, the Baconian, the Lockean tradition, which we'll be getting to in a couple of weeks, to know the difference really between Toryism and conservatism of the Locke, Burke, Smith, Hume variety is really just a form of individualist liberalism, of which the state then is very much one of just a contract one makes, and it's meant to serve the individual interests, wants, and property in entrepreneurial endeavors.